So welcome back. We are going to do a few videos with our daughter Teresa and her husband Greg, asking some questions about making strong marriage, being good parents, and we think you'll enjoy the topics that they're going to talk about.
So Teresa and I communicate in very different ways. I think Teresa prefers to communicate explicitly, like she likes it when I say things out loud, and I prefer to communicate implicitly. I prefer to do things and assume that she can pick up on the communication that or what I'm communicating by my actions. How do we meet each other, I guess, is the question I have.
So the very first thing that came to mind when you were talking about that was Chapman's love languages. And I think in some respects they've been overblown. They've been given too much attention. I think some people approach them as if they've got more global answers than they do. But one of the things that I think is very good about them is they've given people an example, a real concrete way to look at the idea that we communicate differently. So even though I do think the 5 love languages, there does seem to be sense to them, they at least, even if those are not the languages, they at least have said, this person tends to communicate in way X, this person communicates in way Y, and so they're speaking past each other a little bit. So that's a little bit. I mean, you guys have already got that recognition, right? So that the language that you tend to speak is also the language that you tend to want to have spoken to you, which is, again, kind of makes a lot of sense. But I also like to encourage people to think of different circumstances. So the way you are at school or at work or when you were in the Marines and stuff, you communicated differently there than you might do in your marriage. And that is lots of times because we have assumptions or we take for granted and so on, right? So for me professionally, if I wanted advancement in some way, then I would make sure that I communicated in a way that my supervisor knows I am really competent. At home with my children, with my wife, I might not always check that because I don't have the same kind of external pressure. So some of it is about kicking yourselves in the pants and saying, my communication with this person matters more actually than any other communication in my life. And just because I communicate with him or communicate with her all the time, I still have to put in proper effort. Now, it would be draining for us. Like, I mean, one of the reasons why we don't do that all the time is because we, for good reason, want to relax in our home when we're with our spouse. But we do need to amp up our game at least some of the time. And so when you're picking up that things are not quite happening here, then you don't fly in hot, right? You go in and say, if Teresa's acting upset, and we can usually tell when our spouse is upset, right? Without explicit communication, we know something has happened. So if we think that's happening, we can go in there, again with good intentions, and say, it seems like something's off here. Can I ask, what happened? And then for Teresa then to say, well, when you did this, I asked you to do this, you didn't do it. Or you came home, but you didn't give me a kiss. You didn't say, how was your day? And then you have the chance to respond to that. And then she can also communicate back, oh, okay, well, this is what I was thinking. This is what I wanted. And I realize now it wasn't fair or whatever, right? It's a chance for you guys to share your experiences with one another, which is a lot of what we're doing in marriage. And recognizing that, again, I don't want to overplay the subjective, because I think sometimes there is an overplay of that. But there is also a real place for the subjective. And so I've sometimes told people that unlike in the real world, scientific world or whatever, the objective sometimes doesn't matter as much as a person's perceptions, right? So you perceived that I hurt you, that matters a lot, maybe even more than the fact that I didn't. I did nothing that objectively was hurtful, but you think I did, and because you matter to me, I don't want you to have that feeling. Even if you were wrong about it, I want you to know that that's not the case, and then we revise that and so on. I also believe, again, you guys are near the beginning of marriage, that changes over time. So you start to accustom yourself to one another, which means Greg starts to adapt to Teresa, but Teresa also starts to adapt to Greg. And so Teresa maybe doesn't need explicit language all the time, right? because it's her disposition, she should get explicit language some of the time at least, because that matters to her. But she also, because you matter to her, she's also going to be like, Greg doesn't do that all the time. I know he loves me. When I'm using my rational brain, I know there's not a problem. But,
Yeah.
so.
Related to the last question, what attitudes are important in communication?
Well, to me, my initial response to that is just attitude. And I've talked about before on these videos that in counseling, I think there's kind of three key things that we're looking at. We're looking at what people know, so their knowledge. We're looking at what they can do, their skills, but also attitude. And I believe that attitude is the most important of those components, but it is also the most difficult to change. So be that as may. One of the benefits in a marital relationship, a romantic relationship, is there's a lot of motivation to change, especially near the beginning when that excitement is on. And so if your attitude is not quite on target, there's a good chance that you want to make the change. Right? When you're aware of it, you want to do something about it, unless you think it's unjust. But the basic attitude, I think, is just that goodwill. Right? It's the I want what is best for this other person, which I think is kind of the key way that we talk about when we say what is love. Love is wanting the best for the other. We add to that in romance that there's also an excitement. Right? There's a passion that goes with it in romance. And so the wanting is not merely, I have chosen to want the best, right? There's a passion to say, do something about that, go with that, right? Mm-hmm. And so if it's not entirely there, then for people to be able to work through that process of building it up, this is the good and the bad news in counseling, is that almost everything is process, right? Which is kind of good, because otherwise it'd be flip a switch and I'm better, but I can easily flip that switch and now I've become terrible, right? So change takes place over time. And so by continuing to have, as Aristotle talked about, do what you do and you kind of change yourself. And so you continue to think, who is it that I want to be? One practice that can be done, probably on your own, probably not with your spouse, is to review your day, right? To think about, what was my day like with my spouse? It's a good practice otherwise as well. But what was my day like in relation to my spouse? How did I treat her? Okay. What was her reaction? How do I feel about all that kind of stuff, right? Where do I think she was wrong? And I throw that in on purpose because a good relationship is not merely about how do I make her happy, because her happiness can also be a selfishness. And I don't want that for her. I want her to be her best, right? And I do that in a way that is loving and usually incremental. And so as a man who's been married going on 28 years, it's a process of being polished, right? And I look back at it and I can't really see anything in particular that my wife did that made me change, but I am not the same man that I was when I got married. And there's a lot of my faults that have lessened over time, and I think much of that has come from my wife, right? By doing things that she either did on purpose, intentionally, or just in the process of us relating to one another and trying to have a good family life together. I think that's maybe where it came from. So.
That's sort of a tough thing to sort of like try and manage your expectations about how much change you're going to experience, but also having the hope to know that you will eventually
and you're exactly. Balance is also one of those things. So you basically enter a relationship, any type of relationship, not expecting to change the other person. You're accepting the person. That's it. But none of us are perfect. And so in the process of being in a relationship, and the same thing can be said of friendships, friendships make us better. Again, I think it was Aristotle, maybe it was Plato, who talked about the idea that a good friendship is a friendship that is about perfection, right? It makes us better people. Where it's not always like, yay, we're really enjoying it, but it helps us to be better. And so, again, you enter a relationship not expecting the other person to ever be different. You're okay with who the person is. But in the process of being in a relationship, we want to help the other person. And it also seems to naturally occur if we're in real, authentic relationship with one another.